Earlier, well, in fact, it was just last week's set of lectures, we talked about the end of the Cold War. So that happened essentially by 1989. The Soviet Union would be dissolved in the early 1990s. And for a brief moment in time, there was a hope that perhaps for the first time in decades, going all the way back before World War II, that the United States and the world for that matter could now live in peace, that there would not be war and strife. Well, as it turned out, there would be several problems in the 1990s, a lot of ethnic warfare in Eastern Europe as the Soviet Union broke apart and the consequences of that. But the biggest threat, particularly from the American perspective, was terrorism. And especially in comparison to other Middle Eastern countries, the United States was not really threatened by terrorism to as great as an extent, at least until we get to, of course, September 11th of 2001. So after we talk about this lead up to September 11th, 2001, we are then going to go on to how the United States carries out this war on terror. Because originally, it goes about a way that you might expect, attacking those who were responsible for September 11th. And that was the rogue state, if you will, of Afghanistan. But then the whole war on terror sort of goes off the rails because what George W. Bush does, the son of the former president of the United States, George H.W. Bush, who we just talked about, George W. Bush takes the war to Iraq. So that's where we'll finish up our class today, and that's where we'll finish up the semester. The man on the right of this screen, Osama bin Laden. Most Americans will know his name and his face after September 11th, 2001. But before that, despite being sort of a media sensation, carrying out a lot of interviews on TV, making these statements across the airwaves, most Americans do not know who he was. And that's because, like I alluded to in the intro to this lecture, terrorism really never hit the Americans. Between 1993 and 2000, only 90 Americans were killed as a result of terrorist acts. Now, the most notable terrorist attack on American soil occurred in February 1993. In that year, Muslim terrorists set off a bomb in the basement of the World Trade Center in New York City that killed 6 and injured at least another 1,000. Now, I do want to do a sidebar here because when we're talking about terrorism in this class, we are focusing on foreign terrorists. Now, also during this time, you also see a growing internal domestic terrorism. Timothy McVeigh, of course, in 1995, will bomb the Murrah Federal Building down in Oklahoma City. But we are going to be focusing on this lecture, on these foreign terrorists. So nonetheless, here is a World Trade Center, bomb in the basement, February 1993, kills 6 Americans, injures 1,000. This is the first strike against that mecca, if you will, of the global financial system, the World Trade Center in Manhattan, New York. Well, as the investigators begin to look into who was behind the bombing, who was the mastermind behind this bombing, their attention turned to Osama bin Laden. Now, Osama bin Laden was an unlikely terrorist in the sense that he came from a wealthy family in Saudi Arabia. Well, 4 years before, in 1989, he had formed Al-Qaeda, which was known as the Base. Well, as the United States became more involved in the Middle East in the early 1990s, it built many bases in the region, particularly Saudi Arabia. So now you have all these American military bases in the Saudi Arabian country, an ally of the United States. And this was very controversial because Muslim clerics began complaining of these Christians who were in their midst. Bin Laden, too, was angry that non-believers were being invited into his country. Well, eventually, bin Laden's protests and violent actions in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere led to him being asked to leave Saudi Arabia. Well, Osama bin Laden eventually settled in the Sudan before being expelled from that country for possibly playing a role in the attempted assassination of the Egyptian president. So here is bin Laden without any place to call home, he will eventually make his way to Afghanistan. Basically a disaster of a country that has no stable foundation, economics, government, or otherwise, and it is controlled at this time by the Taliban. Now, like the Taliban, bin Laden opposed Western civilization. So what were his issues with Western civilization? He particularly was opposed to its secularism, its non-religiosity, its materialism, trying to buy up consumer goods, its arrogance, its support of women's rights, and technological advances. Well, in 1995, 2 years after the bombing at the World Trade Center, bin Laden would continue to go after Americans, this time abroad. In 1995, a car bomb went off in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia in front of a U.S. training facility, killing 7, including 5 Americans, and injuring about 34. Bin Laden took credit for this bombing against U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia. The following year, in 1996, bin Laden offered his, quote, declaration of war against the Americans occupying the land of the 2 holy places, which was this long-winded diatribe against American forces that were again stationed in the Holy Land in Saudi Arabia. Well, on August 7th, 1998, the 8th anniversary of U.S. troops arriving in Saudi Arabia, bin Laden would order the bombing of the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in Africa. Combined, these 2 bombings killed more than 200 people and injured thousands more. As this was going on, Al-Qaeda was spreading across the globe, and it had nearly 15,000 members. This all will, of course, lead to September 11th, 2001, where we'll see the 2 images on the right. Now, it's always interesting to discuss this part of the lecture because 2001, of course, was not that long ago. But for many of you who are listening to this lecture, most of you were probably not even born at that point, and if you were, you were quite young to remember this. But all across the television, as it was going on in real time, you would see the initial fire out of one of the towers of the Twin Towers, the World Trade Center in New York City, and eventually another plane would fly into the other building. You would see a plane flying into the U.S. Pentagon, the home of American military. So this was very shocking for a lot of people. And it wasn't like terrorism was unheard of. I have this first point in the slide, a lack of preparedness question mark. And I put the question mark there because there were officials in Washington, D.C. paying attention. And we see this in terms of federal funding. Federal funding for counterterrorism rose by perhaps as much as 50% in the late 1990s, reaching $9.7 billion. And in terms of actual physical policies, in response to the bombing of the embassies in Africa that I just mentioned in the last slide, the United States carried out Operation Infinite Reach in 1998. Operation Infinite Reach. And this involved using Tomahawk missiles to be fired at Al-Qaeda bases in Afghanistan and a pharmaceutical plant in Sudan thought to be manufacturing chemical weapons for Al-Qaeda. Now, it failed miserably, killing only low-level Al-Qaeda operatives, but nonetheless it pointed to a knowledge among U.S. officials that terrorism was a threat that had to be dealt with. But regardless of these actions, the 9/11 Commission report. So the 9/11 Commission report was a several-year investigation by prominent government officials. And it released its report in 2004, 3 years after the event itself. And it found the following, and this is a direct quote: "The most important failure was one of imagination." So what this meant was, despite growing numbers of terrorist attacks against Americans abroad, the U.S. government tended to downplay the issue, according to the report. And what made this idea of a lack of imagination more prominent was the weapons used by these terrorists. And that, of course, was airplanes. It's one thing to use bombings as were used abroad, but to use airplanes was at an entirely different level. So the way that Al-Qaeda operatives invaded the U.S. caught most officials off guard. And here is in fact what happened for those of you who again were not alive during this time. So it was at 8 a.m. on September 11th, 2001, a Tuesday morning. 19 hijackers took control of 4 airliners. 2 of the planes struck the World Trade Center buildings, while another hit the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. The 4th plane was headed towards Washington, D.C., but likely because some of the passengers had received word of what happened already in Washington and New York City, these same passengers crashed the cockpit door, wrestled with the terrorists, and forced the plane down in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. So in all, in these 4 crashes and the destruction they caused, a total of 2,977 people died as a result of these terrorist attacks. Now the question became, how was the United States going to respond to these terrorist attacks? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to finish up this lecture by talking about 2 things. The next slide will talk about the homeland, if you will. What is going to happen to the United States to ensure that another terrorist attack will not take place on American soil. Then the rest of the lecture will deal with how the United States carried out its war on terror abroad. Within a month of the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, the Congress had written and passed the USA Patriot Act. Now, up until the first time I taught this class, I didn't realize that the USA Patriot Act was actually an acronym. So I want to actually explain what it involved. And you can see this acronym spelled out to the right. Uniting and strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism. And in fact, what you're going to see in the debates that you're reading for this class this week is a concern between 2 ideas that I want you to pay attention to while you're reading this document. A concern over national security, again, an effort to prevent another terrorist attack in American soil, but on the other hand, the need to preserve civil liberties. But nonetheless, the Patriot Act would allow the government to obtain what it called roving wiretaps to target individuals rather than just a single telephone, because the realization was that these terrorists were using these burner phones, these cellular phones that allowed them to talk a couple times, get rid of it. And previous to the Patriot Act, every time the government wanted to intercept one of these calls, they would have to get it for every single phone that was used, not just the individual. Well, the Patriot Act also empowered federal agents to obtain orders allowing them to seize any tangible things. So now these search warrants no longer had to specifically say, we are going into this place to get this, this, and this. Now federal authorities were allowed to get any tangible things, including customer records from a business. Finally, we would see 2 additional measures as part of the Patriot Act. It allowed the federal government to more easily seize assets and also deport suspects. And finally, it lengthened the statute of limitations and sentences for terrorism-related crimes. So what does this mean? It means that now you're going to have these terrorists who are sitting for years in jail cells waiting for rulings to come out, sentences to be distributed. This is where you're going to see Guantanamo Bay housing a lot of these aging terrorists up until the present day because of what this Patriot Act allowed. So that was in 2001. The following year, we would have a growth in government, actually. And this growth of government occurred when President George W. Bush signed into law legislation that would create the Department of Homeland Security to essentially bring together all of these different groups meant to prevent another terrorist attack on American soil. Now, this became sort of a running joke of what the Department of Homeland Security did, because what they would come out with is this color-coded slide on the right that would be shown on television for several months after the Department of Homeland Security originated. And basically, what color that day was how worried you were supposed to be of a terrorist attack. Well, the only problem is that nearly every single day it stayed on yellow. meaning there was an elevated significant risk of terrorist attacks, meaning that people became sort of inured to it. They ignored it because if it was always elevated, it did not really have any meaning any longer. Once America had set up the infrastructure and the new laws to prevent another terrorist attack in American soil, it dealt with how this war on terror would be fought. And this begins here on September 20th, 2001, when Bush will declare a war on terror. And this is a document that you're reading for this class. And one of the things among many that I want you to pay attention to in this document is how Bush describes this war as being a different sort of war from previous battles and from previous conflicts, and sort of divides the world up again. You're either with us or you're against us. Just as sort of during the Cold War, you're either communist or you're anti-communist. So there are some similarities in the way that this war is being fought as compared to earlier wars, but there are also some differences. But nonetheless, shortly after Bush declared this war on terror, American troops were deployed to Afghanistan. Taliban bases were hit with airstrikes, and funding and arms went to the Northern Alliance, a group of anti-Taliban forces in Afghanistan. Well, this would be a relatively quick war, at least it seemed so early on. The Taliban would flee the capital city of Kabul on November 12, 2001. In late November and early December 2001, the government came together in Afghanistan. So what we are going to see is the main anti-Taliban groups meeting in Bonn, Germany, under the auspices of the United Nations to create a new government in Afghanistan. The Bonn Agreement, as it's known as, that was signed in 2001, December of 2001, specified that there would be a central government and an Afghan army, and it created economic and legal institutions. It also decided that Hamid Karzai would serve as the new head of state of Afghanistan. Well, the final constitution, along with the official election of Karzai, occurred in March of 2004 and October of 2004, respectively. So what we are going to see here is it looks like Afghanistan is coming out of this tremendously successful. The United States went in quickly, cleared out the Taliban forces. Osama bin Laden went away in various different cave dwellings and escaped, but nonetheless, it looked like Afghanistan was on the right track. Well, as it turned out, we would see a quick turnaround. And a lot of this had to do with the United States not deploying enough troops in Afghanistan. So for instance, in 2002, the United States deployed only 8,000 troops in Afghanistan, which forced the weak Afghan army to face a growing insurgency alone. What we are going to see as a result of this is by 2005, Taliban and Al-Qaeda leaders that fled to Pakistan started returning to Afghanistan. So this goes on, problems continue, making this, what I have at the top of this screen, a forever war. Well, when Barack Obama became U.S. president in January 2009, 65,000 troops were in Afghanistan. He would more than double that number to 150,000 by the middle of 2010. Yet, when Donald Trump became president of the United States in January 2017, only 8,400 troops remained. And as a result, and up until the present, neither peace nor stability existed in Afghanistan. This map is indicative of how, despite being over in Afghanistan for nearly 20 years, the United States has fared terribly in controlling that country. So this map is representative of what it is like in Afghanistan up until the end of February of 2020, so very recently. And what we'll see here is the dark green area, the Taliban, that ran out of Afghanistan in November of 2001. Now 19 years later, they control a good chunk of Afghanistan. particularly if you'll see there the Helmand province in southwestern Afghanistan. But even beyond that, we see a lot of those lighter greenish, bluish areas where they're contested. And the white areas, very much far and few between, those are the areas that are under control of the Afghan government. So here we are, nearly 20 years after this war in Afghanistan started, and what we see is the conflict is still raging, and who controls Afghanistan is still very much up in the air. And this is after thousands upon thousands of Americans were killed and hundreds of thousands of Afghani people were killed. Clearly, there is no end to this forever war in Afghanistan, as we see on this map. As the United States was focusing on Afghanistan, it was also paying attention to what was going on beyond Afghanistan. It was carrying out this global war on terror. And I'm going to show you a map here on the next slide in a second. But before I do that, I want to give you a few brief statistics here to understand how wide this global war on terror is. By 2018, the United States was actively engaged in countering terrorism in 80 nations on 6 continents. Between 2001, when this war on terror started, and 2018, the United States spent $1.9 trillion to fight terrorism. The State Department has spent another $127 billion to train foreign police, foreign military, and border patrol agents abroad. So clearly this is a costly, time-consuming, and expansive effort to root out terrorism. And we see that here illustrated in this map that is really just mind-boggling. So you can see the key at the bottom of the screen here, but you can see these stars, these white stars in a blue circle. Those are U.S. military bases. We can see how those are spread all across the country. And then we have those sort of shooting sites in the orangish, yellowish color. Those are military training and assistance centers. And then we have combat, which are the orange circles with the white kind of starish figure, the blast figure, if you will. Drone strikes, the red circles. Drone strikes were a big weapon used by Barack Obama during his administration. But what I want to use this map for, more than explaining all the different ways and counterterrorism activities that were occurring here in 2018, is I want to look at where it's occurring. Because what we can see there is, towards the center right of this map, we have Afghanistan, we have Saudi Arabia, we have Iraq, and we have India, and we have Pakistan. That's where a lot of what we've been talking about and what we will be talking about was going on. That's where a lot of this war on terror was occurring. But look at where else it was occurring. Particularly what surprises a lot of people on this map is look at Africa. Look at how many circles cover the expanse of Africa, which for most Americans is not a hot spot for terrorism. But nonetheless, for the United States, it has a lot of activity there fighting this war on terror. Critics of George W. Bush argue that Afghanistan is still up in the air. The outcome of the war in Afghanistan is still up in the air so many years later, because Bush turned his attention away from that nation to another enemy of his father, in fact, George H.W. Bush, Saddam Hussein, and Iraq. Though still bogged down in Afghanistan, the Bush administration shifted most of its own focus and the public's focus to Iraq, especially that guy that we see on the right hand of this screen, Saddam Hussein. Now I want to be clear about this. In spite of what George W. Bush said in the early 2000s when he was defending this policy of going against Iraq, Iraq played no part in the September 11th attacks. In fact, Saddam Hussein was one of the strongest opponents of the fundamentalist Islam, followed by Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. America, of course, and this is the reference that I was making to George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush's father, America, of course, had easily defeated Iraq a decade earlier in 1991, after Iraq had invaded its southern neighbor, Kuwait. In Operation Desert Storm, which involved a massive airstrike on Iraq, ground troops were able to push the Iraqi military out of Kuwait in just under 100 hours at the cost of only, and obviously you can say only because wasn't that for the people who had to experience it, but only 148 American deaths. Now here's the thing, even back here in 1991, many conservative critics were angry with George H.W. Bush that he ended the campaign there, that he ended the campaign when Iraqi forces were pushed out of Kuwait, because these critics believe that the United States should have overthrown Saddam Hussein, not just force his troops out of Kuwait. So this would continue. These conservatives in particular, the neoconservatives as they were called, the neoconservatives, would continue to pressure both George H.W. Bush and his successors to do something against Iraq. Well, this would lead President Bill Clinton in 1998 to initiate a 4-day airstrike against Iraq. Well, this wasn't even enough for one of those neoconservative groups, A Project for a New American Century. This is what they said, at least part of what they said, the quote below. It is clear that this danger cannot be eliminated as long as our objective is simply containment, and the means of achieving it are limited to sanctions and exhortations. As the crisis of recent weeks has demonstrated, these static policies are bound to erode, opening the way to Saddam's eventual return to a position of power and influence in the region. And here's the important part here, because this idea of regime change will really color the approach of George W. Bush when he becomes president in 2001. Only a determined program to change the regime in Baghdad will bring the Iraqi crisis to a satisfactory conclusion. So it's these neoconservatives and groups like the Project for a New American Century who would be whispering into the ear later on, years later, that would encourage George W. Bush to eventually turn attention away from Afghanistan over to Iraq. Therefore, already in 2002, the United States and the Bush administration would begin pushing and making a case for war against Saddam Hussein in Iraq. In early 2002, during his State of the Union address, George W. Bush referred to an axis of evil, and among which he included North Korea, Iran, and not surprisingly, Iraq. He pointed to the efforts undertaken by each of these nations to produce weapons of mass destruction that could possibly reach terrorist groups. So this is the important piece, and you see this in the Dick Cheney document that you're reading for this class, how the Bush administration tried to link this seemingly unrelated individual, Saddam Hussein, to the terrorist issue. He was producing weapons of mass destruction, they argued, and those could possibly reach terrorist groups. Well, by June 2002, speaking before the graduating class at West Point, Bush would proclaim the following: "If we wait for these threats to materialize, we will have waited too long." So why do I read that quote? Because what I'm showing here is what is known as the Bush Doctrine. Preemptive war. We cannot wait for the Saddam Hussein's government, the Iraqi government, to do something wrong. We have to go in there beforehand, Bush was proclaiming, and therefore change the regime, just like the Project for a New American Century was calling for in 1998. Well, as this was going on, the United Nations was actually involved as well, and they were actually sending in UN inspectors to look for these weapons of mass destruction. And we see this in this political cartoon on the right that was published in June of 2008, actually. And what this shows was sort of a dig at the Bush administration. The comment on the left was the UN official with the big UN button saying, "We need more time to search for weapons. We can't find them." And you have Uncle Sam character saying, "No way." Well, now, by the time we get to later in this war, when war actually begins, the United States too says, "We need more time." Because, to kind of spoil the ending right now, no weapons of mass destruction were ever found, even though that was the primary argument given for U.S. involvement in Iraq. Well, nonetheless, over the next 8 months in 2002, Bush and his administration officials would claim repeatedly that Saddam Hussein possessed or was in the process of building nuclear weapons. Condoleezza Rice, George Bush's national security advisor, would say the following: "We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud." So again, the idea is we can't wait for Saddam Hussein to act. We have to go in there preemptively to stop him and change the regime. Bush went before the United Nations to get the support for invading Iraq. He did not gain that support. The United States, however, did find greater success with Great Britain, Australia, and 40 smaller countries. So therefore, we move ahead to March 17th of 2003, when George W. Bush warned Saddam Hussein that if he did not step down, the United States would attack, which it did 2 days later on March 19th with the Shock and Awe campaign. And this was a massive airstrike, the Shock and Awe campaign, a massive airstrike that greatly weakened Iraqi forces. Operation Iraqi Freedom, as this was known as, the entire operation, would involve 140,000 troops. Baghdad was under U.S. control in 5 weeks, and Saddam Hussein had fled. He would be found in 2006 and eventually hanged. So this dramatic turnaround of events here within 5 weeks controlling Baghdad led George W. Bush on May 1st, 2003, landing in full fighter gear in a fighter aircraft aboard a U.S. carrier, proclaiming mission accomplished. So this was in May of 2003. And if you open your newspapers up into the present day, you will know that the United States is still, to a far lesser extent than ever, but nonetheless still involved in this war some 17 years later. So clearly, President George W. Bush was not entirely correct in believing that mission was accomplished here in May of 2003. And a lot of the problems in Iraq mirrored those in Afghanistan, meaning sectarian violence. Without the authoritarian grip of Saddam Hussein, sectarian violence would break out between the Sunnis and the Shiite Muslims. So therefore, the United States would become wrapped up in this. And as this was going on, as I alluded to earlier, no weapons of mass destruction would ever be found in Iraq. By December of 2006, U.S. military personnel killed, nonetheless, had surpassed 3,000. Therefore, as conditions tended to worsen by late 2006, Bush would initiate the so-called surge in 2007, early 2007, which would involve a buildup of an additional 21,500 troops. And that we will see by 2007, there will be over 170,000 U.S. troops in Iraq. This some 4 years after, again, Bush declared mission accomplished above the aircraft carrier. So we will see this number go down by 2011 to 47,305. There are still some U.S. soldiers in Iraq up until the present day, and it still is struggling to this day to become a new nation outside of what it was for Saddam Hussein.